Thank you very much for coming. It's great to be here. I've flown over from London to spend a couple of days with you, and it's a real privilege to be included at this event and to talk about the work that we do around measuring social sentiment. So I'm from a company called BrandsEye. We're an opinion mining company, and we really try and understand what's driving sentiment across social media predominantly. And what we believe about the world is this, is that how people feel today influences what they do tomorrow. And if you just pause for a second to think intuitively about that, how people feel today influences what they do tomorrow. And if we just take that back to human relationships, if my wife is angry with me, she's not, luckily, well, she's a little bit now because I've been traveling for 2 weeks. But if she's angry with me and I don't listen to her, say she's frustrated that I'm playing golf every weekend and I'm not helping her with the kids, or whatever it might be. I hear an R in the front here. He's clearly heard that before. She might not leave me tomorrow, but unless I listen and change my behavior, eventually she will leave if I don't correct that. And if you follow that same kind of way of thinking through to a company with its customers, if a company tells its customers, I'm going to give you this product or this service, and they don't deliver, eventually that customer is going to leave. And the same rationale rings true about a government and the people that it serves. If a government doesn't do what the government said it was going to do, eventually the people vote in a different direction. And we call that the expectation gap. It's the gap between what someone promised and what the person experienced. And social media really plays in that place of, it's that expectation gap. It's where people go to say, I'm frustrated about this, or I love this, or you said you were going to, but you didn't. Or why are you saying this when we see something else happening in the world? And so this phenomenon, or this kind of basic human truth of how people feels influences what they do tomorrow, how people feel today, is something we see in the world of social media. And what I want to talk about today is really what are the examples in the world where we've seen that, and how have we been able to measure it to help either leaders or executives make better decisions around the people that they're serving. So let's pause for a second and just think about social media as a source of information. I think for many, and certainly when I got involved in social media 5 years ago, it held this promise for me of this wealth of data which could tell you anything about the world. And my initial thought was, imagine if we could measure sentiment towards stock markets. I could build an engine which could just trade automatically based on sentiment that people are expressing. Turns out it's quite hard to do that, but I'll come to that a bit later. But social media at its core has created this global network of people that are connected in a way that even 10 or 15 years ago, it simply did not exist. And what that means is that information spreads very, very quickly. Something can happen, and minutes later, people in the world know about it. And we've all seen those kinds of crises or things unfold. You can be almost certain that the moment Donald Trump tweets something, everybody knows. It's on news channels, it's everywhere. And it's because of that ubiquity of social media and how quickly it can spread. And the danger of that, or the danger and the potential of that, means that people can be informed about information or ideas can be spread very, very easily. And that gives, if I see a phone being launched in the US, and I'm from South Africa originally, and I'm sitting in South Africa, I can very quickly get frustrated with a phone that's in my pocket because I suddenly know about something that's out there. Whereas 20 years ago, the service that you got, you didn't know about what else was out there. And so your expectations weren't changed as quickly as they are today. And what that means is that this source of information really needs to be put into the hands of executives who can help make decisions about that, because it gives them a competitive advantage. And today we're going to look through some of those examples of how have politicians or organizations gained the upper hand through using social media to try and meet their customers really where their customers or their constituents are at. So if you just take a moment to read this tweet, I feel like I'm always between somebody and the screen, so I'll just keep moving around so everyone can see. But a person reads this, and you can understand what this person means. You can see that they are clearly negative towards Donald Trump. There's somebody who's not happy. The immigration ban, which was signed in February of this year, This is somebody who read that and said, please can you explain? The challenge is reading one tweet is easy. Reading thousands or millions becomes very hard. And we heard it for those who were in the session before this on AI and machines. The moment AI gets something wrong, the consequences can be catastrophic. And we've seen that in the judicial system in the US, where they realized that the system that was deciding on the parole, who gets parole, was racist, because it had been trained on many years of judges making decisions. And it turns out that racial bias had crept into the training data for the machine. So if a black person came up for parole versus a white person, the white person was more likely to get it. And you don't know that training data is creating those biases in your machines unless you get into the guts of it. But that's a whole different tangent of AI, which I'm not going into. But applying AI to understanding humans is actually a very, very difficult thing. Because as I said, humans get humans. A person can read this, and you can see what somebody means. When a machine reads this, it thinks it's positive. And that's at its core why social media has held so much promise but delivered very little value. And for those who've played with natural language processing on social media, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This is very hard. In fact, there's a competition that happens every year. And these are the results from the 2017 competition, where the machines get tasked with trying to understand Twitter. It's one of the tasks in there. They take a couple thousand tweets, and this is in English, never mind in Korean or in Swahili or other languages around the world. But the best in the world, the best algorithms in the world today can get a 66% accuracy on sentiment on social media. And that's for those into statistics, that's marginally better than flipping a coin. You know, it's really not that great. And if you're an executive trying to understand how your customers feel, it means at best you're going to understand 6.5 out of 10. So the other 3.5 you're just going to get wrong. And to the example that was used in the previous session, they might be really angry and you come back with a very sort of cute response, which makes them even angrier. So this is a real problem, because the scale of social media means that it's very difficult to read all of it, but the tools that are there to mine it are still not yet commercially useful. And that'll change as the years go on. But right now, this is the challenge that we face in the world, is AI can't understand human language on social media. And at its core, I think this is where many organizations kind of tackle unstructured data from the wrong angle. It's really they come to unstructured data or opinion data. When I talk about unstructured data, I mean just people's language as used on, so it could be social media or in the feedback form that somebody sends at the end of a call. It's the way in which people speak in language which is not kind of ticking a box to say this is a 5 out of 10 service. This is the opinion that is shared. And the challenge that I think organizations face is when you approach that in a data-first kind of model, then you end up using algorithms first to try and understand it. But at its core, a human understanding is a human problem, not a data problem. And so I think organizations need to take this approach first to say, let's put humans first, not machines first, in our attempt to try and understand one another. And you need to go no further than a relationship with your significant other to understand that this is true. If you try and put a machine in between you and your wife to translate, or you and your husband, you're in for a trouble. So why would you do that with your customers or with your constituents? So really today I'm going to talk about how we then unpack this. And the first example for us that came up was Brexit. Now bear in mind, we've been in business for many, many years. But social media for a long time, and you'll probably all know this story, it sat within digital marketing within an organization which really had very little influence over the rest of the organization. That's changed significantly over the last year. And so I'm going to just talk through Brexit and the US elections just to try and understand how has that social media landscape changed and what does that mean for the world. And then we're going to look at some corporate examples as to where this matters. So if I take you back almost 18 months, we'd done a deal with CNBC Africa, and so I had a weekly slot on television to talk about what was happening on social media. And during that time, we started to see Brexit was happening. A week or two before Brexit, these sorts of polls started coming out, and it looked like it was going to be close, but everybody thought it's a Remain vote. You know, the UK is going to stay in the EU. This Remain is kind of the fringe people who feel that way. And so these were the stats that came out. And even those other companies on social media were saying it's going to be a Remain vote. But the challenge, as I described earlier, is understanding social media is actually very tricky. And so what we did with the social data is we put it through our platform, which is a blend of crowdsourcing and machine learning. I'm not trying to do a sales pitch for us, but it's how we solve data at scale is we have a crowdsourcing platform similar to Mechanical Turk, which is Amazon's crowd platform, which means we can process large amounts of data through native speakers around the world. That could be crowds in Kenya or in South America or in the Middle East. We use local people to understand. And so we take that human-first approach of using humans to understand humans. And when we did that in the UK, we came out with almost the polar opposite of what everybody else was saying, which for us it was 57% were saying leave. And when I looked at that, I thought, hang on, either we've got this totally wrong or people have missed what's going on in the UK. So I was on TV that week, and I remember doing a call inside one of my clients' offices with a few other journalists on TV speaking about Brexit. And I said to them, I think it's going to be a leave vote. And they literally laughed at me. I said, well, what does social media know about elections? You know, you stay talking about digital marketing, and then you fast forward 2 days, and it was a leave vote, and suddenly things changed. Not just for us, but we suddenly realized, hang on, social media has come of age. Because when we drill down, I just want to take you through this quickly. When we drill down to the underlying data, we could see that even at a city level and down to a town level, the sample of people that we got from those towns was statistically significant, that it was representative of how that town or city voted. And so we could see the split between the major cities voting Remain and the outlying regions voting leave. And that for us was that was almost the bigger win, because social media, it felt like it was starting to come of age, that this is no longer the fringe people talking, but actually this is the voice of the people, and it can be representative of major issues on how people felt. And so we're encouraged by that. Then fast forward a couple of months, and we get to the US elections, and obviously this is a big issue today. It was great having Hillary Clinton speaking this morning. But what we saw, and again, it was the same. We saw these polls, the other organizations out there. It's a quote from The Guardian I love: Trump won't win. In fact, the US could be on the brink of a liberal renaissance, which is just, now you look back and you think it's comical, but that is how everybody felt. And if you take yourself back a year, it's what the world felt. Like it's clearly going to be a Clinton win. And yet again, when we looked at our data, so what I have here, let me just quickly talk you through this chart. The blue line is the Clinton, pro-Clinton, anti-Trump sentiment. So bear in mind with the US elections, this was much bigger. This was 48 million conversations over the whole time, and then obviously less closer to it. But it was millions of people speaking, and the issue in the US wasn't who was the favorite. The issue who wasn't the least favorite. And so we had to take this massive negative sentiment into account, which is something which is actually very difficult to do. A poll can't measure negative sentiment effectively, yet in the unsolicited opinions on social media, that was the bigger part that was coming out. And so what we had to do was to split the conversation into 4 buckets. Who are the people who are pro-Clinton, pro-Trump, and then anti-Clinton and anti-Trump? And I think what everybody saw was the pro-Clinton and the anti-Trump, and then a little bit of pro-Trump. But I think what the world missed was the anti-Clinton. And that's really what changed very quickly, just straight out of the conventions in July. Oopsie, let me go back. She was way ahead out of the conventions. This is when she was elected at their convention, or at least when she spoke. She got ill around that time, and within a month, we saw it go head to head. This is on social media. She was still way ahead in the polls. When we saw that, we thought something's happened in the US, which we're not seeing in the rest of media, and we need to pay close attention. And we actually tried to get to the Democrats at that time to say, you need to pay attention. But when you've spent $1 billion on data, you don't want to spend any more on data. So we didn't have any joy. Anyway, fast forward, we kind of saw this to and fro between Trump and Clinton, and then in the weeks prior to the election, we saw him surge ahead. And when we saw that, we thought, this is remarkable from a data perspective. But we knew that we had to get it right at a state level, because if we'd gotten it right at a macro US country level, we would have gotten it wrong, because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So we had to drill down to a state level and look at the swing states, which is what we did. So we took the 11 swing states, whoever was speaking in those states on social media, recorded their conversations, processed that through our crowd to then understand the pro-Trump, anti-Clinton, pro-Clinton, anti-Trump sentiment. And then we created a poll essentially out of that by just inferring how people feel today is going to influence what they do tomorrow. So let's measure how they feel, because that'll give us an indication of what they're going to do. And what we saw in every swing state was this resounding pro-Trump sort of rhetoric, which baffled us, because it just wasn't what was happening in the news. And when we saw this, we realized we were onto something. And bear in mind, we were a relatively small company at that stage. So I flew to London to go because we knew if this is what we're seeing, we need to go and get a platform to it. I flew to London in the week before, and then tried all of my contacts that I had to try and get an interview on TV to talk about this. And the day before the election, I got a call from the BBC to go and speak on worldwide television about what we were seeing on social media. And to say the least, I was sufficiently nervous. Our chairman had said to me, look, don't call it one way or the other. Let's just play it safe here, because this is a big deal. We don't want to get this wrong and just kill all the value that we've built up. But I'll show you the clip from that event.
Is Jean-Pierre Cloppers, CEO of BrandsEye. Now, BrandsEye is a media analysis firm which has been examining online commentary for and against the key candidates. Thanks for joining us. Just tell me a little bit more about what you've been doing exactly.
Right, so we listened to all the conversations emanating from the USA on social media. So it's 27 million conversations we looked at over the past couple of weeks. And then we use BrandsEye's crowdsourcing kind of platform to try and decipher how do people feel in those conversations. It's 3 million people. So we look at a statistically significant sample of that data to try and work out in each state, what's the advocacy, what's the kind of emotion on the ground towards each of the candidates leading up to the elections, and how does that change as various events play out in reality.
So in a word, at the moment, you think Trump will win on your analysis?
Yeah, if you ask for my opinion, it's different, but if you ask for what we're seeing in the data, that is what the data is saying. It's saying he's got a huge amount of support, and I think we may have underestimated it.
Jean-Pierre Cloppers, really interesting to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. So that was the BBC, and then for us, I was in London, the elections happened, and my phone started going crazy at 4 a.m. London time, just as people started messaging me, and I was really mixed emotions. I want to be really happy and really sad at the same time. But I think what happened in the world is the world changed in that moment. Suddenly, and we've seen this play out over the past 8 months, social media has gotten a lot more attention than it used to get. And that's not just because Donald Trump is tweeting. I think it's because people have realized that actually the voice of the people matters, and we need to pay more attention to trying to understand that. These were the results that we got, our columns on the right. So we got 9 out of the 11 swing states right, which is pretty remarkable for a company we're just a data company. We've got no political scientists in our employ. At that stage we had no Americans, we do now. But we're just from the outside looking in and could tell more about what was happening in the US than even Twitter could tell on their own data. And it's because of this approach of using humans to understand humans. It's not rocket science, but it is really critical in terms of how we do this analysis and where we feel like the value lies. Shortly after this, I got the invitation to come and speak here, but I've been to many countries over the past 8 months to talk. And I was in Mexico in February talking at an AI conference. And this was 2 weeks after the immigration ban was signed. So I had to go to Mexico, where some of the other speakers weren't allowed to go because of the immigration ban, because they couldn't get back into the US. So it was real. And I had to go and talk about AI, but also what we were seeing. And I thought, well, let's look at how people feel about the wall. So you can't go to Mexico and not talk about the wall when that's the most popular topic on everybody's lips. So again, we saw these kinds of stats in the polls. Immigration ban is one of Trump's most popular orders so far. A few other headlines. And so we just thought, well, let's look at what people on social media. And this is 2 months after the election that we looked at this data. So it's a pretty short time frame. And it's the same people, same social media that was talking about electing Trump that we could see, which was now talking about the immigration ban and about the wall. So if I had to ask you, what would you think? 2 weeks after Trump took office, or 2 or 3 weeks thereabouts, he signed this immigration ban. How many Americans would you say on social media came out in support of the immigration ban? Any guesses? What percentage of Americans on social media do you think supported the travel ban? No one volunteering? What do you think? 60%? That's what I thought, 60%. It was 1%. It was 1%. When I saw this, I said to my team, go back, do it again. This can't be right. Surely that's not right. And the truth is, it isn't right. Like if you had to go and ask everybody in the US what did they think about the immigration ban, you'd get a different result. But here's the important thing about social media. It told something about the fabric in the US had changed substantially in a very short period of time. That the same people who are willing to express their opinions, that we want this person in office, had suddenly gone quiet within a very short space of time. And we didn't understand it then. I stood up at that conference and I said, I don't know what's going on in the US, but something's changed. So the support base for Donald Trump has rapidly and radically been eroded. Because even on the wall, the support base for the wall was only 9% of Americans, 4% more than Canada, of people saying we're in support of this. It was bizarre. And when we now fast forward, this kind of makes sense, because if you look at, this is from Nate Silver's site, 538, if you look at Trump's approval rating, they've slid hugely. He's now the least favorite president of all time, I think. But in February, that wasn't the case. And so again, it just was this beautiful example of how measuring sentiments on social media, it gave a clue. It's like when you're playing poker against somebody and they have a tell, and you see the tell and you realize what's in their hand, what they're going to do next. They don't even know that they're showing you by the tell. And social media is like that. It gives you these clues as to the emotional responses of people, either by what they do say or by what they don't say. And that's an immensely valuable source. And so what I want to look at for the remainder of this presentation is really how we see that play out in the corporate world. And what are some of the examples of where companies have either done this well or done this badly. This is actually the first time I'm showing this particular set of data here. We looked at the top couple hundred CEOs in the world. We took lists from Forbes, Fortune, a few others, collated them all, put all of those top CEOs not put them on Twitter. We tracked everything that they said over the period from June last year to May this year on Twitter. And then we've looked at who are the top 30. And for them to qualify to be in the top 30 CEOs, they needed to be spoken about more than 40,000 times in that year by other people. So getting a high degree of traction within Twitter. So it does end up being quite heavily US skewed in the data because there's a lot more happening on Twitter there. We then took that data and looked at what is the net sentiment towards each of these CEOs. How many people like them? How many people dislike them? And then ranked them. And the reason we wanted to do this is because increasingly, and I love Mark Benioff's quote here, CEOs have to be responsible for something more than their own profitability. When politicians don't get things right, corporate leaders have to act. And if we look at the last 8 months, and certainly the theme over the last 2 days, this has been a huge theme. What do we, as not just as government, but as society, as individuals, as businesses, and as government, what do we do to try and address both the challenges and the opportunities that we see in the world? And so I want to look at some of how these have performed. So here they are, ranked 1 to 30, the top 30 CEOs in the world. So some interesting things. Brian Chesky is right at the top from Airbnb, and he's magnificent because what he did off the back of the immigration ban is he said, we'll give free accommodation to any immigrants or refugees that are affected by the immigration ban. Huge amount of support. And I'll talk through all of them in a second. All of these companies are doing well. 4 out of the 5 of these companies have had terrible performance. And bear in mind, these are the top CEOs in the world. And yet when we look at the barometer of how people feel about them, it actually very closely resembles what happens in the world. And I'll speak a little bit about just what do we see in common in the top 3, and also what do we see in those who are ranked the worst. So if we look at the drivers of positive sentiment, there are 3 main factors that come into what is the kind of ingredients to make up the top CEOs in the world as those who are loved on social media. The first one is company performance, and this is good. You can't get away from the fact that companies that perform badly very, very rarely have CEOs that are loved. And so company performance is a big one, and we reference Mark Benioff there with Salesforce. You love the American sort of arrogance of the quote, Salesforce #1 CRM, great. The second one is around accessibility. And John Legere, he's from T-Mobile, CEO of T-Mobile. He's got over 4 million followers on Twitter. And he takes huge amounts of time to respond to people individually. And you think that's a ludicrous use of his time. He probably has teams of people who help him, but how he appears to his customers is very accessible. And so that's the kind of second common factor that we could see in the data that these top CEOs had in common. The third one was around social responsibility or social and political leadership. And that's where I reference Brian Chesky. I've told that story about what he did, and we'll look at some of that data. So here we see, this is net sentiment. Now Airbnb, you would imagine, should have mostly positive sentiment, except that there's actually a lot of risk there as well. You know, if my home's on Airbnb and somebody rents it out and they trash it, and I don't get a quick resolution with Airbnb, you can be very sure I'm going to tell that story on social media. And somehow Airbnb has managed to avoid that kind of massive negative press. I've spoken about the big spike where his single action of saying, let's take a stand on something and help people in the world really, really got them ahead. Legere, this is what I find interesting. The fact that he's right up there to me is fascinating, because this is a mobile operator. T-Mobile, it's a telco, and no one speaks positively about their telco. I mean, who in the room here has ever got onto social media to say, I love my telco? It's not the kind of thing you do. You always go on to complain about them the moment there's something wrong. So the fact that he's managed to generate an overall net positive sentiment is remarkable, and it shows you the kind of leader that he is. If we look at on the negative side, right down at the bottom was United Airlines, and we all know why that happened. So I won't take too much time to go through this, but to very quickly recap the story, there was a passenger on a United Airlines flight. The flight was overbooked. They asked people to leave. No one wanted to leave, so eventually they forcibly removed somebody from the plane, dragging him off, and he got really injured. And so that's a big issue. But you can get through those kinds of things by how you deal with it. The problem was that the CEO dealt with it badly. He took a long time to respond, and when he did respond, he came out in support of his staff and the actions that they'd taken, which when you unpick it, you can kind of understand what he was getting at, but he just got crucified on social media. Whereas the day before, United was getting kind of 9,000 odd mentions a day. Over the next 2 days, they got 2 million. Conversations on social media, so it just exploded, and it eroded everything that he'd built up. I mean, bear in mind, this is the guy who, two or 3 months before, no, it was a month before, he was voted the best communicator by PR Week, best communicator, and he'd been shortlisted for Forbes Business Person of the Year. This was a good executive. He'd done a really good job. One thing happens on social media, and suddenly all of that goodwill is eroded. And this is the part of social media that people are afraid of, is that it is this minefield. And so many executives don't want to engage for fear that if something goes wrong, it can quickly spiral. But as we can see in this case, he didn't even have a Twitter account, and yet it spiraled anyway. So I don't think this is something which any leader in the world today can ignore. We really have to have strategies. Because what then played out subsequently is their share price tanked. That's the sentiment that suddenly dropped over that day, net sentiment, and over the next couple of days, their share price kind of reflected what the market felt. But again, how people feel today influences what they do tomorrow, and we saw this play out with United Airlines. If we then look, I'm going to look at 2 or 3 more examples. This is one from close to home. So one of South Africa's banks was voted the best bank in the world. Isn't that great? For a South African bank, Capitec Bank. So I want to just look at they're one of our clients actually. So we're very proud of them. But I want to look at just what we saw. So this is a bank who they only started 5 or 6 years ago. They were a digital bank, then started some stores. So they've come out of nowhere to compete against a very well-established, well-funded industry. And what you see on the chart here is just the net sentiment towards all the banks. It looks like a bowl of spaghetti. You can't really tell much from it. And so we need to drill down deeper. And what we do, this is just a graph from our application, where we map sentiment at a topics level. So let me just describe how this kind of data mining on social media works. We first weed out all irrelevant information. So if it's United Airlines, you get rid of people saying, let's stand united against the airlines, because that's not about the brand, that's about people talking about the industry, and you want to get rid of that. The second one is categorizing it into positive and negative. And that algorithm example that I shared at the start, that's the task that algorithms get right at best 6 out of 10 times. But it's a critical task to get right, because if you get that wrong, you start putting things in the wrong bucket. But that's not enough, because if I said to you, your wife is angry with you, it's good to know that your wife is angry with you, but it's much better to know why. Because unless you know why she's angry, you can't do anything about it. Similarly, if you're a woman and is your partner. And the why for us is critical. And so for many years, social media analytics has been around sentiment, which actually doesn't help anyone. Because if I told you your customers are frustrated, you're like, great, I knew that already. It doesn't help me. How do I make any decisions differently if you just tell me they're angry? I need to understand why. And so what we map here is the entire competitive set. These are all the big 5 banks in South Africa. And then every customer experience type area. So when people compare brands, when it's customer service, when they're threatening to cancel, when they can't get hold of something, availability, when it's about price, staff. And so we can map these, and I'll show more complex examples of this when I look at an example a bit later. But really, when you look at this, you can very quickly see, I just want to share 2 things. The one is everybody gets complaints about banks. So that's normal. So an executive shouldn't worry that they're getting complaints on social media. They should worry that are they getting more than the norm? And B, how do they resolve that? And this is where Capitec really is in a league of its own. They're the only bank with this positive footprint. And if you look at price, you can see that they get 0 negative conversation, all positive. So this is an area, if we talk about that expectation gap, where they've created an expectation with their customers, and they've absolutely filled it. And their customers experience nothing else. In customer service, it's a bit more variable, and they get the same negative customer service footprint, but they manage to turn that around way more often. And so what's happened in South Africa is their market share has skyrocketed. They are now the second largest bank in the country in less than a decade. Just think about that. They now have 9 million customers. You can see that's from June 2017. 9 million customers, just behind Standard Bank, which was the best, and they're busy flagging. But you can see every other bank has slowly just been eroding their market share. And incidentally, we went to the other banks 2 years ago to say, you're missing something on social media in that we're seeing a lot of negative sentiment that's not being addressed in the way that Capitec does. And in a report to our client, we actually said, this was 2015, we said, we predict that you're going to steal significant market share from the others based on what we see on social media, and it's exactly what's happened. The last example that I want to share with you before we break for some questions is to look at Uber. Now, they've taken a lot of heat over the past couple of months, and if you'd look closely in the 30 that we ranked, Travis Kalanick is in there. He's in the negative section, but everything that's happened to Uber with him specifically is post our study, in case you're wondering. But Uber's a great example for me of where drilling down into why people feel the way that they feel matters. And again, if we take kind of 5 big cities, I think 4 of these are in the US, and then we added Cape Town. and we look at net sentiment over time. So this is the kind of thing that executives would care about. Let's see when there's a spike in sentiment, what's driving it. But for everybody in the room here, that's again fairly meaningless. You can see that in this red line there is Cape Town. They had huge positive sentiment over that time. And then the others, we can go into all the details of it if you're interested. But I think what I wanted to share is if we then take two of these cities and we drill down into what's driving sentiment at a city level, this is where it gets really interesting. So these are the major themes as to when people take an Uber, this is what they're experiencing. When they talk about Uber on social media, these are the things they're talking about. They talk about the ride experience, they talk about the company itself, they talk about customer service, they talk about the drivers, the reasons why they're taking Uber from a financial perspective, and they talk about ethics. And then we can map these against two cities, and immediately you see some interesting things. That in Cape Town, the ride experience is by far the biggest factor driving the customer experience, whereas in the US it's not. In the US, or at least in New York, it's very close to the corporate reasons. And the corporate reasons are Uber as an employer, the employment of drivers. People in New York care way more about that than in South Africa. And so if you're trying to apply policy across an organization like Uber, which is sort of a one policy fits all cities, you're going to fail. You need to be more bespoke than that. Here I've just ranked the negative topics. So when people speak negatively about Uber, what are they complaining about? And in Cape Town, it's the driver, physical safety. And we can see that in New York, it's around Uber as an employer or driver earnings. Those are the big things. So as an organization, if they're going to try and tackle things at a city level, it helps you to prioritize what are the issues that we need to address. And when you look at it, again, I kind of zoom out at a macro level, both cities have a similar footprint. 80-odd% people talking about the operations of the company, 20% talking about the reputation of the company, so the corporate responsibility type things. And so you could think that they're the same, but when you look underneath those, you see that on responsibility, in Cape Town, it's around safety of the driver, and it's about protests. In Cape Town, other taxis were literally burning Ubers outside of train stations because they were so frustrated that they were stealing their customers. Whereas in New York, the reputation is different. It's about the culture of the company. It's about regulating drivers, how much they're getting paid, much softer issues. But as a PR person within Uber, you have to have a very different strategy for New York as you do for Cape Town. And social media gives you this ability to map that across all of your, whether it's all of your branches or all of your customers, all of your regions, to be able to get much quicker to what's driving sentiment at a local level. And I want to close with an example, again, from Uber. So this is from a couple of weeks ago when the mayor of London rescinded or decided not to renew Uber's license to operate within the city of London. And so YouGov put out this poll which said 43% of Londoners support the ban, and only 31% of Londoners said they felt the TfL's decision, that's Transport for London, that their decision was wrong to ban Uber. And when I looked at that, I just kind of intuitively thought, can't be right. Surely that's not true. Because as somebody in London using Uber, I just know that that's not how people felt. So we went onto social media, and this incidentally was a survey on 400 people within London, 50% of whom, 20% who were semi-regular users of Uber. The others had either used it once or twice and then never again, or had never used Uber. And that's the data which is now being used by the city to justify the decision. But actually, when you look on social media, you can see, taking out the neutral conversation, that actually, that just says value. Oh, that's a mistake. It's 48%. 48% of people on social media were against the ban. And so you've got to take both of those into consideration. Yes, people want Uber to be regulated, but they also still want Uber. And I think having only one side of the poll only gives you one side of the answer. And that's really the closing thought that I want to leave with you for today, which we've seen as one consistent thread throughout all of the work that we've done, that there's still very much a case for traditional research and the types of polls that happen in elections. But often what social media gives is this clue as to what are we missing. In the US elections, it was the mistrust towards Hillary Clinton. In the banking example, it was that ability to convert and match expectation. In the Uber example, it's people want both. It's not a binary decision of regulation or Uber. It's we want regulation and Uber in the city. And so it really helps you to color in from an emotional layer how people feel about things so that as executives or as leaders, we can make better decisions to serve those people. Thank you very much for listening.